10 Typewriter Tales, a collection of stories, written by Thomas Fincham, narrated by John William Cantiz. Mish-Mash Fiction. He sat, staring at the computer screen, tapping his fingers on the keyboard keys. Come on, he muttered. He had written one paragraph. Now, all he had to do was write several more. He had started writing at 5 p.m. the previous day. He checked the clock. It was 1:43 a.m. Almost 8 hours had gone by, and he had only written one measly paragraph. He reread the 3 lines, and then hit the backspace key, deleting them completely. Now, in all of those hours, he had written nothing. He covered his face with his hands. He wanted to cry. He looked up. The wall behind the computer was covered with framed pictures. There was a picture of him on the cover of Time, Newsweek, and Maclean's. There was a picture of him with Oprah, and a picture with the president when he visited the White House. The First Lady loved his work and had invited him for a luncheon. He got up and walked around his condominium. It was the most exclusive in the entire city. It had cost a mere $2 million, but the place came with the finest furniture, and also artwork worth much, much more. It also came with a private elevator and a 24-hour cook. He pressed a button and heard the voice on the other end ask, "Yes, sir? Can I get 1 Hawaiian shake with ice, Francois?" "Right away, sir." Sebastian Tomplay was only 26 years old. He was now worth a cool $5 million. Exactly 1 year before, he did not even have $50 in his bank account. He waited in the kitchen. He leaned on the exquisite marble counter and bit his fingernails. He always did that when he was nervous. There was a ting, and he slid the door open. Inside the small space, no bigger than a microwave, was a thermos. He opened it and pulled out the glass filled with orange and yellow liquid. He put the thermos back inside and pressed the down button. Francois's kitchen was in the basement of the condominium, and it had a small elevator that reached each of the condominiums. Instead of having someone constantly deliver food to the clients, Francois would simply put it in the elevator and indicate which unit to stop at. Sebastian walked back to his office and sat behind the computer. The screen was white. His eyes caught a black metal contraption sitting to one side. He sighed. He looked at the time. It was 2:15. He had less than 7 hours to write a book somewhere in the range of 250 to 300 pages. At precisely 9 a.m., he was to deliver this book to his publisher. He glanced at the blank screen and then at the time. He began to cry. 1.5 years ago. He pedaled hard and fast. He raced the bike through the crowded downtown street at an exhilarating speed. He zoomed past parked cars. He maneuvered around the oncoming traffic. He narrowly missed hitting pedestrians. He was huffing and puffing and was nearly out of breath. Sebastian was a courier for a small company that catered to law firms. Legal documents, subpoenas, court orders, anything of vital importance that needed to be delivered immediately would go through the company. Right now, he had a package in his backpack that he had picked up from the law library that had to be at the courthouse in a few minutes. He sped around the corner and saw, in the distance, a man wearing a fancy blue suit. He was standing impatiently at the courthouse steps. Sebastian accelerated, eased into the sidewalk, and then braked, not 2 feet from the man. "That's cutting it close," the man said. Sebastian didn't say anything. Instead, he pulled out the package and handed it to him. The man tore the package open. Inside was a stack of photocopied papers. The man smiled as he glanced over them. "Thanks," he said before bouncing up the stairs. Sebastian checked his watch, made a note of it in his record book, and then turned around. He took his time as he moved around the busy street. The company would bill the firm from the delivery service, which meant Sebastian didn't have to worry about being paid right on the spot. All he had to do was deliver the goods on time, and the rest was the firm's problem. He stopped on the way and picked up a hot dog from one of the many vendors lining the street. As he chomped on the hot dog, he glanced at the hustle and bustle before him. People were rushing from here to there. They were on their cell phones. They were typing in their BlackBerries. Impatient drivers were honking their horns. For them, life was a rush, and they were rushing with it. But for Sebastian, that was not the case. After finishing college, he got a job in a collection agency. He hated it. All day, he spent searching for people who had defaulted on their payments. All day, he listened to them lie and lie and lie. After a couple of months of this, he stopped showing up to work. Soon after, they fired Sebastian, which was fine by him. He went on unemployment insurance and did nothing but sit at home and play video games. He thought about applying elsewhere, but couldn't get past the feeling of feeling confined. It was as if his life was being sucked out, 1 minute at a time. He would remember sitting there and staring at the clock, wondering when the time would come when he could get out of this hellhole. When the unemployment insurance money ran out, he had no choice but to find a job. He saw an ad in the paper for a courier, and he applied for it thinking he wouldn't get it. He did, and for the last 9 months, he had been on his bike, 5 days a week, 10 hours a day. At first, it was terrible. The traffic and the addresses were hard to get used to, but he reminded himself that it was better than being stuck behind a desk. He was free. Sure, there were time constraints, but what job didn't have constraints? At the collection agency, he had a weekly collection quota. Thursdays and Fridays were the worst, where he would scramble and at times stay late just to meet it. He was finishing the hot dog when he got a call. He pulled out his cell phone, which was paid for and provided by the company, and said, "Sebastian." "Carol Nanium," the dispatcher said. "There's a package on 31 Elmore Street that needs to be delivered by 2 at 348 Leonard Boulevard." Sebastian looked at his watch. He had more than enough time to pick it up and deliver it. "Gotcha," he answered. He casually made his way to the address, and as he was approaching what looked like an office building, he saw a man wearing a trench coat standing at the corner. The man was old and looked haggard. His face was wrinkled, and he hunched over. A homeless person, Sebastian thought as he moved past him. Suddenly the man said, "You the delivery boy?" Sebastian stopped. "You the one who is to take the package to Leonard Boulevard?" Sebastian nodded, not sure what else to do. From behind him, the man picked up a square cardboard box and handed it to Sebastian. Sebastian grunted. "Man, this is heavy." "I need you to deliver it by 2, the man said. This isn't right, Sebastian thought. He was used to dealing with actual companies, not some man on the side of the street. "Something wrong?" the man asked, with a hint of irritation. Sebastian shook his head. He secured the box to the back of his bike and pedaled to the destination. All through the ride, he couldn't get over the way the man looked at him. It was as if he knew and was waiting for him. He got off the bike and began pushing it. He still had more than enough time, and his legs were beginning to ache from the weight of the box. Thankfully, this was going to be his last delivery. As he got near, he stopped. He saw 346 Leonard Boulevard, and right beside it, 350. What happened to 348? He looked around. He saw the buildings across the street had addresses 347 and then 349. Is this a mistake? He thought. He called Carol and confirmed the order was for 348. Biking back to Elmore Street, he cursed. He was going to give the old man an earful. This bloody box was killing his legs, not to mention the bike's tires. When he got there, the man was nowhere to be found. He went inside 31 Elmore Street, but no one had heard of this old man. He called Carol and told her this. She said the man had dropped by earlier and paid for the delivery in cash. She told him to bring the box back. Sweating and in pain, he lugged the heavy box to the company's office. All the while, he thought hard about dumping the item, or, at the very least, opening it. He heaved the box up the stairs and into a room that was used by the company to store undelivered items. Eventually, either the old man or someone who was expecting the box would contact them. More than 6 months went by, and no one claimed the box. It was the company's policy that all unclaimed items would be destroyed if not claimed within 180 days. As it was beyond that, the box was placed aside to be picked up by the disposal agency. At a routine stop to the office, Sebastian saw it, sitting in the corner. He remembered how heavy it was and how much pain it had caused him. He also remembered the old man and his unforgettable eyes. He asked Carol if he could have the item. It wasn't company policy to let couriers keep unclaimed items because this had caused problems before. But after explaining to her what had happened to him, she said yes, just as long as he didn't tell a single soul, and he took the box without anyone noticing. He agreed. After dropping the box on the dining room table, he poured himself a cold glass of orange juice. He was soaked in sweat. Chugging down half the glass, he took a key and sliced open the sellotape. Inside, he found a black metal object, the size of a small photocopy machine. He pulled it out and examined it. There was a slot marked with a picture of a book that had an arrow pointing at it. Behind it was another slot with no markings. There were buttons on the side. Sebastian moved his fingers over them. Suddenly, they lit up. Startled, he jumped back. Where's the power plug, he wondered, looking around. There were no wires coming out of the device. The arrow blinked. Sebastian stared at it. Then the picture of the book blinked rapidly. It continued blinking. Then a beeping noise erupted from inside. Sebastian looked around and grabbed a copy of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. He placed the book in the slot, and slowly the machine began to suck it in. The blinking stopped, but it started again when the novel had disappeared inside. Bleep, bleep. Sebastian searched for another book and put in a copy of Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? More blinking, more bleeps. After placing Agatha Christie's The Murder of Roger Ackroyd inside, only then did the blinking and bleeping stop. He paused, not believing that the machine had gobbled 3 books. He paced around the room and then decided to grab something to eat. He made himself a cheese sandwich and then went to the TV. There was an old episode of I Dream of Jeannie on the Classic Channel. Sebastian bit into the sandwich and tried to enjoy the show. His mind was still on the machine and the books it had devoured. He might have to break or smash the device to see where they went. As the commercials rolled, he heard a noise. It sounded like a screech. He lowered the volume and listened. No, it was more like the sound from an old printer. Where's it coming from? He wondered. He went to the window, and the noise disappeared. He focused and realized it was coming from the kitchen. He rushed over and stopped. From the back of the machine, a piece of paper was slowly coming out. Sebastian leaned in and saw there were words on the paper. It's printing, he thought, with wonderment. A couple of minutes later, the page was completely out. He scanned it. For the next several weeks, the machine purred out many more pages, sometimes 10 pages in a day. Not knowing what else to do, Sebastian kept them in order of arrival. Then, one day, it stopped. No more pages. Nothing. Sebastian grabbed a stack of pages. From his estimate, it looked like there were over 300, and he began reading them. When it was done, he realized he was holding a complete novel. He didn't know what to do with the manuscript, so he put it aside. One day, while having coffee with a friend whom he'd known since his college days, his friend mentioned that he was in a creative writing program. Sebastian, albeit reluctantly, mentioned he had a complete novel at home. His friend was shocked and surprised that Sebastian had been quietly toiling away at a book. His friend offered to read it. The next day, Sebastian gave it to him. A couple of hours later, his friend called back. "This is brilliant," he nearly screamed on the phone. It had a classic undertone, but was set in the future, and was wrapped in a good old-fashioned whodunit. He asked if it was okay if he showed the novel to his professor. Sebastian replied, "Sure." Not 2 days had gone by before the professor himself contacted him. He was as excited, or even more so, than his friend. The professor wanted permission to pass the novel on to an agent he knew. A week later, there was a bidding war, and the agent secured a deal for $500,000 for 2 books. The excitement was palatable. The publisher that had won the rights to print the book could smell a mega hit. Everything was fast-tracked, and in 3 months, the novel came out to rave reviews and stormed up the bestseller lists. Sebastian Tomplay was the hottest thing in the literary world. He was sent on a 12-city tour, unheard of for a first-time author, which then turned into a 20-city tour after the first one was a success. He did talk shows, radio interviews, book fairs, the whole lot. Then the question came. Did he have another book, or was he a one-hit wonder? Sebastian had no concrete answer. All he said was that he had some other works in progress. One day the machine whirred to life again, the same blinking and bleeping. Prior to this, Sebastian had tried to play with the buttons, but nothing made the device start up. Seeing this, he grabbed 3 different books: a book on global terrorism, a book on jokes, and a straightforward thriller. A month later, he was holding a manuscript that was later promoted as a book that dealt with contemporary issues, with edge-of-your-seat excitement, but also had a sense of humor. Again, the novel flew off the shelves. If Sebastian was hot before, now he was on fire. He toured the world, Asia, Europe, even Africa. His readings and book signings became an event. Hundreds of people, sometimes thousands, would line up to see him. He was even offered small cameos in major Hollywood movies. Rights to his books were sold for 7-figure sums. He dated models, daughters of senators, and even CEOs. It seemed everyone wanted a piece of Sebastian Tomplay. All this was happening too fast and too furious. He had written and published 2 novels in the span of 6 months. The world eagerly awaited his new masterpiece, and so did he. 3 months went by, and the machine didn't come to life. There were murmurs that maybe he was going through writer's block. Maybe the great Sebastian Tomplay had just as quickly dried up. Every interview he did, they asked the same questions. When is your next book coming out? Are you currently working on it? Will it be as good as the first 2? To all the questions, he answered a simple yes. But in reality, he didn't know. The breaking point came when, on his 5th visit on Oprah, in front of millions of people after being asked repeatedly, he mentioned a date on which his 3rd book would be revealed. Returning home, he grabbed a copy of Stephen King's Carrie and shoved it in the mouth of the machine. He pushed the entire novel in, but then something horrible happened. There was a loud crack, as if something had burst, and then smoke emerged, nearly tripping the fire alarm. His eyes widened with horror. I broke the machine. Now, 3 months later, he sat, crying, unable to control himself. In 6 hours, he would be revealed as a hack. But that wasn't the worst of it. He would have let down many people. He wiped his eyes. The only thing he wanted right now was to go back to being a courier. Things were simpler then. He was free. All this money and fame had brought him nothing but misery. He was confined to an image that was not real. He was not a writer. He was not the author of 2 mega-selling novels. He was just a guy who got lucky. Leaning back in his chair, he closed his eyes. He would have to face the music. He would have to call his editor and tell him the truth. Well, not the entire truth, because no one would believe the part about the machine, but he would have to say he was done as a novelist. In 6 hours, he would make the call. Suddenly, he stopped crying. A smile crossed his face. If my career is going to end, then why not end it the right way, he thought. He began to type feverishly. By the time he made the call to his editor, he had a completed manuscript in his hand. The book came out again to rave reviews. It sold millions upon millions of copies. It was a fictional story of a young woman who discovered a machine that would enable him to create brilliant works of literature. Reviewers, critics, and readers considered it a spoof of the great Sebastian Tomplay. Here was a man who had achieved so much, but who was willing to mock himself. Sebastian didn't think of it that way. This was the truth, whether they knew it or not. The publishing world never heard from Sebastian Tomplay again, and this was fine by him. He sold his expensive condo, put his money into a savings account, and went back to being a courier. On the side of his bike, he taped up the words, "When fiction becomes a reality, that's when things begin to get scary." This has been 10 Typewriter Tales, a collection of stories, written by Thomas Fincham, narrated by John William Cantees. Copyright 2021 by Thomas Fincham. Production copyright by Thomas Fincham.